The wreck had been lying on that ridge in Laos for 43 years. The two skeletons in the cockpit were still strapped into their ejection seats, harnesses fused to bone by 4 decades of monsoon and rot. Their flight suits were the color of wet leaves. The boots were standard-issue United States Air Force, the soles still legible at the heel where the rubber had been thickest. 20 meters downslope, half buried in red laterite mud, lay 4 more skeletons. American jungle boots, American web gear, CAR-15 carbines with serial numbers the Pentagon insisted had been turned in for destruction in the autumn of 1969. One of those rifles had a strip of olive drab duct tape wrapped around the pistol grip. On the tape, in faded blue ballpoint, 2 words remained legible: Weems, Tupelo. The pilot of the aircraft had been Major Curtis Weems of Tupelo, Mississippi. He had been in the sky. The rifle had been on the ground. To understand how a dead pilot's name ended up on a rifle held by a dead man 20 meters below his own canopy, we have to go back 43 years, to the early dry season of 1971, and to a fictional close air support mission codenamed Operation Jade Lantern. Wherever you are in the world, take a moment to share it in the comments. It really matters to us to know who's listening and where from. Every subscription helps bring new stories to life. The first thing the Lao deminer noticed was that the trees on the south face of the ridge were the wrong age. He was a man in his 50s named Kamla, hired through a contractor working under a joint Lao-American agreement on the Bolaven Plateau in the southern highlands. He had been clearing unexploded ordnance for 26 years, and he knew that a forest grew back in a particular rhythm after fire. The rhythm on the south face was wrong. The hardwoods were too young, the bamboo too thick, and a long oval scar of secondary growth lay across the slope like a healed burn on a man's back. He marked it on his map and radioed the team leader. The team leader was an American named Dale Murchison, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel working as a civilian liaison for the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency. Murchison had spent 31 years in uniform, the last 9 of them in a windowless office at Hickam, reading after-action reports from a war that had ended before half his co-workers were born. He came up the ridge on foot, breathing hard, his fatigues already soaked through with the kind of humidity that does not evaporate but only accumulates, and he stood at the edge of the oval scar and felt the back of his neck go cold. The smell was the first thing. Not death, not after 43 years. It was the smell of laterite mud baking in the sun, of leaf rot, and underneath those, faintly, the smell of old aviation fuel cooked into the soil. JP4 has a half-life in clay that nobody quite agrees on. Murchison had smelled it before, on 3 other recovery sites, and he knew it the way a butcher knows the smell of a refrigerator that has been off for a day. They worked the site for 9 days before they understood what they were looking at. The cockpit section came up first, a buckled rectangle of aluminum and titanium half swallowed by the slope. The tail number had been ground off by impact and time, but the data plate on the left engine survived, an F-4C Phantom II, attached to a fictional tactical squadron operating out of Ubon Royal Thai Air Base. Tail number 64-XX112. 2 crew. 2 skeletons still in their seats, their helmets cracked along the crown but otherwise intact. Major Curtis Weems, aircraft commander. Captain Glenn Hargrove, weapons system officer. Both had been carried as missing in action since the early dry season of 1971. Murchison sat down on a fallen log and lit a cigarette and watched the Lao recovery team work the cockpit with the careful slowness of men who had handled a lot of bones. He was a short-timer in his own way, 2 years from full retirement. He had been thinking about a cabin in Idaho. He had been thinking about a daughter in Sacramento he had not spoken to in 11 months. He had not been thinking about ridgelines in Laos. On the morning of the 10th day, Kamla came down the slope holding something in a clear plastic evidence sleeve. It was a CAR-15 carbine. The metal had been eaten by rust until it was the color of dried blood. But the receiver was intact, and so was the serial number stamped into it. And so was the strip of duct tape wrapped around the pistol grip. The tape had been green once. It was the color of weak tea now. The handwriting on it was still legible because the ink had been pressed deep into the adhesive by a man who had wanted the words to stay. Weems, Tupelo. Murchison read it twice. He looked up the slope at the cockpit section, where the bones of Major Curtis Weems of Tupelo, Mississippi, were being lifted out of an ejection seat by a forensic technician in blue nitrile gloves. He looked back at the rifle. Kamla said, in careful English, "Sir, there are three more rifles." Murchison understood that immediately, but Kamla shook his head and pointed downslope, past the bamboo, into the deeper green. "3 more men, sir. American boots, American gear." Murchison put out his cigarette in the laterite and stood up. The skin between his shoulder blades was prickling in a way he had not felt since a flight line in Phu Cat in 1968, when a sergeant had told him very quietly that the aircraft he was about to board had a cracked main spar. By dusk, they had logged 6 sets of remains on a ridge that should have held 2. 2 in the sky, 4 on the ground. All Americans. All in gear that, according to the records Murchison would request that night by satellite phone, did not exist. He sat in his tent with a bottle of warm water and the rifle in its evidence sleeve on the cot beside him, and he stared at the duct tape until the kerosene lamp guttered low. The name on the tape matched the name in the cockpit. The rifle had been on the ground. The pilot had been in the sky. There was no version of this that made sense. There was no version of this that did not mean somebody had lied. The remains came home in 18 aluminum transfer cases on a C-17 out of Vientiane. The Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency Laboratory at Joint Base Pearl Harbor-Hickam was a low building of pale concrete on the edge of a runway, and inside it the air was always 68 degrees and smelled faintly of denatured alcohol and floor wax. The forensic anthropologist assigned to the Bolaven case was a woman in her early 40s named Dr. Elaine Carver. She had grown up in Vermont, taken her doctorate at Tennessee, and spent 11 years identifying soldiers who had been bones longer than they had been men. She did not consider this work morbid. She considered it overdue. Murchison flew in 2 days after the remains arrived. He had not slept on the plane. He drank a cup of black coffee in the lab break room and stood with Carver in front of a long stainless steel table on which the bones of Major Curtis Weems had been laid out in anatomical order. The skull rested on a foam block. The duct-taped rifle sat in a separate evidence tray beside the femurs. Carver did not look up from her clipboard. She said, "The cockpit pair are straightforward. Dental records on Weems are a match. We are still waiting on Hargrove's family, but the Air Force ID disc was in the seat pan, and that is preliminary." Murchison said, "And the other 4? Carver tapped her pen against the clipboard. She said, "The other 4 are a problem." The 4 ground sets had come up in worse condition than the cockpit pair. Acidic soil, monsoon flooding, animal disturbance. But Carver had recovered enough to know that all 4 had been adult American males between the ages of 22 and 34 at time of death. 3 of the 4 showed healed bone fractures consistent with airborne training injuries. 2 carried surgical scars from procedures performed at Walter Reed in the mid-1960s. 1 had a metal plate in his left forearm with a partial serial number that the lab was still chasing. None of the 4 had dog tags. Murchison said, "None." Carver said, "None. And the gear is wrong." She walked him over to a second table where the recovered web gear had been laid out under bright work lights. She pointed to a canteen cover, a magazine pouch, a butt pack. She said, "This is United States Army issue, but the stitching pattern on this batch was used for less than 14 months, beginning in the late spring of 1968. The contract was canceled when the manufacturer was caught using subgrade thread. The remaining inventory was pulled from supply and listed for destruction." She said, "The same goes for the carbines. The 4 CAR-15 rifles had all carried serial numbers that traced back to a single weapons lot signed out of a depot in Okinawa in the autumn of 1969. The lot had been listed on a destruction order, signed off, filed, and forgotten." According to every piece of paper the United States Army possessed, those rifles had been melted into ingots 45 years before they came up out of the laterite of the Bolaven Plateau. Murchison rubbed his face with both hands. He said, "What about the duct tape rifle?" Carver paused. She walked back to the first table, picked up the evidence sleeve, and set it down between them. She said, "The serial number on the duct tape rifle is not from the Okinawa lot. It is from a different lot entirely, a lot that was signed out 3 months earlier by a different officer at a different depot for an end user that the paperwork lists only as TDY/CONUS/Special Activities." Murchison knew what that euphemism had meant in 1969. He said, "Who signed for it?" Carver turned the clipboard so he could read the line she had circled in red. The signature was a long looping cursive in black ink, slightly faded. The printed name beneath it was Weems, Curtis L., Major, USAF. Murchison stared at it for a long time. Carver, standing beside him, said quietly, "Your dead pilot signed for the rifle on the ground." Outside, the wind had picked up off the runway, and somewhere a starter cart was whining up to speed. Murchison set down the clipboard and put his hands on the edge of the steel table and felt the cold of it travel up through his palms into his chest. He said, "I need everything you have on those 4 ground sets by Friday, and I need the cockpit voice recorder pulled." Carver said, "The cockpit voice recorder fragment is at the lab in Maryland. They have been working on it for 9 years. The last time I asked, the chief technician told me the tape was unrecoverable." Murchison said, "Ask again." The metallurgy report landed on Murchison's desk in Honolulu on a Tuesday morning, and he did not understand what he was looking at until he had read it twice. It came in a manila folder marked Preliminary in red ink across the cover. Inside were 9 pages of stainless prose, 3 soil strata diagrams, and a series of photographs of bone fragments under raking light. Dr. Carver had attached a yellow sticky note to the top page. The note said, "Call me when you have read this." Murchison had spent his career assuming that the F-4C Phantom on the ridge had been shot down. That had been the working theory in the field. Anti-aircraft fire from a mobile 23mm battery, or a shoulder-fired weapon, or simply a freak hit from a small arms volley fired blind into the sky. The wreck pattern was consistent with a high-angle impact at airspeed. The 4 ground skeletons, in this theory, were a separate event. Perhaps a long-range patrol that had been ambushed on the same ridge in the same dry season. Perhaps a coincidence. Coincidences happened in war, and the Bolaven Plateau had been a very busy stretch of geography between 1968 and 1972. Carver's report destroyed that theory in 3 paragraphs. She had recovered 14 bomb fragments from the impact crater. 12 of them were consistent with the casing of a 500-pound Mark 82 general-purpose bomb, the standard ordnance carried on Phantom close air support sorties in that theater. The fragments were embedded in the soil strata at a depth that placed them, in geological terms, beneath the layer of compacted aluminum and titanium that constituted the broken-up airframe. The bombs had hit the ground first. The aircraft had come down on top of them. But the part that made Murchison set the folder down and walk to the window and stand there breathing through his nose, was the third paragraph. Carver had recovered 3 bone fragments from the 4 ground skeletons that contained embedded metal. 2 of those fragments matched the bomb casing. 1 did not. The third fragment carried a sliver of high-grade titanium alloy, whose composition was unique to the leading edge of a Phantom II's wing. The aircraft had not just crashed near the men. The aircraft had hit them, or one of them, at airspeed, low altitude, after the bombs. Murchison stood at the window for a long time. Outside, a flight of C-17s was running up engines on the apron, and the heat shimmer rose off the concrete in long, oily waves. He thought about a phrase he had heard 100 times in 100 briefings. Danger close. Friendly fire. The terms of art the United States military used to describe the moments when a man with a radio and a map made a mistake that could not be taken back. He picked up the phone and called Carver. He said, "I want to know what they were doing on that ridge." Carver said, "I do not think we are going to find that in a normal record search." He said, "Why not?" She said, "Because the 4 ground sets do not exist on any unit roster I have queried. I have run them through every database the Department of Defense maintains, and 3 more that the Department of Defense pretends it does not maintain. There is no record of any United States patrol on that ridge in the early dry season of 1971. Officially, those 4 men were never there." Murchison was quiet for a moment. He said, "And the rifle?" Carver said, "The rifle is the only thread we have. The duct tape, specifically. The handwriting analysis came back this morning. The handwriting on the tape is Weems's. We compared it against the flight log entries in his personnel jacket. It is a clean match." She said, "Your dead pilot wrote his own name on a rifle that ended up on the ground beneath his own bombs." Murchison closed his eyes. He said, "That is not possible unless he gave that rifle to someone he knew." Carver said, "That is the conclusion I am working with." After he hung up, Murchison sat at his desk with the folder open and looked at the photograph of the duct tape under macro lighting. The blue ballpoint had bled slightly into the adhesive, the way it did when the writer pressed too hard. The Y of Tupelo had a long slanting tail. He knew that tail. He had seen it on flight logs from Phuket and from Da Nang and from a dozen other lines in a dozen other folders that morning. The pilot of the aircraft had given that rifle, with his own name on it, to one of the 4 men on the ground. The pilot of the aircraft had then dropped 2 500-pound bombs on him, and the aircraft itself, seconds later, had come down on top of the impact crater at 380 knots. Murchison reached for the phone again. He dialed the number for the laboratory in Maryland that held the recovered cockpit voice recorder fragment. While he waited for the call to connect, he stared at the blue ballpoint Y on the duct tape, and he thought about a question he was not yet ready to ask out loud. The question was this: who had given Major Curtis Weems the coordinates that morning? The widow lived in a small white frame house on the east side of Tupelo, on a street where the pecan trees met overhead in summer and rained massed on the asphalt in autumn. Her name was Margaret Weems. She was 73 years old. She had been 30 when her husband had been listed as missing in action in the early dry season of 1971, and she had remarried briefly in the late 1980s to a man who had not survived a car accident on Highway 78. She had returned to her first husband's name afterward. She had never had a second child. The first child, a daughter, had been born 7 months after Curtis had shipped out for his second tour, and was now a tax attorney in Memphis with 3 children of her own. Murchison flew into Memphis in the spring of 2015 and drove down the Natchez Trace in a rented Ford. He had requested the meeting through proper channels and had been told that Mrs. Weems was willing to speak with him, but did not want any cameras. He parked under one of the pecan trees and walked up to the porch carrying a leather portfolio and a small box of pastries from a bakery in Memphis that he had been told by the agency liaison was the kind of thing one brought. She was a small woman with white hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a blue cotton dress and reading glasses on a chain. She offered him sweet tea on the porch in a tall amber glass with a sprig of mint, and they sat in 2 wicker chairs while the cicadas wound up in the heat. She said, "Before we begin, Mr. Murchison, I want you to know I have been waiting for this conversation for 44 years. I have rehearsed it so many times that anything I say is going to sound prepared. I apologize for that in advance." Murchison said, "Ma'am, you do not have to apologize for anything." She said, "You are kind. You are also lying. People have been kind to me about Curtis for 44 years, and most of them have been lying. I am not angry. I have just stopped pretending." She showed him the photograph after the second glass of tea. It was a black and white print, 3 by 5 inches, the edges yellowed and one corner bent. It showed 4 men standing in front of a corrugated steel hanger somewhere with no markings on it at all. The men wore tiger-stripe fatigues with no rank insignia and no unit patches. They held no weapons. They were smiling, the way men smile in photographs they expect to laugh about later. The man on the left was Curtis Weems, 28 years old, hair cut so short it was almost a shadow on his scalp. The man second from the left was Glenn Hargrove, his back-seater, the only one of the 4 whom Murchison recognized from the personnel files. The man third from the left was a stranger to Murchison, a tall, thin man with dark hair and a long face. The man on the right was a stranger too, slightly shorter with the same long face. Margaret Weems tapped the photograph with her index finger. She said, "Curtis brought this home on his first leave in the summer of '69. He told me it was from a training exercise in Florida. He told me the 4 of them had been in a class together. I knew he was lying because the date stamp on the back is a date he was supposed to be at Eglin, and Eglin does not have hangars without markings." She said, "I never asked. He never told." Murchison studied the photograph in the porch light. The 2 strangers on the right were almost identical in the face. Brothers, he thought. Maybe twins. He said, "Ma'am, did your husband ever mention a name? Anyone he served with? Anyone he stayed in touch with?" She thought for a long time. The cicadas rose and fell. Somewhere down the street, a screen door slammed. She said, "He had a habit. It is a small thing. I do not know if it matters." He said, "What habit?" She said, "When he gave a man a piece of equipment, he wrote his own name on it. Not the man's name, his name. He told me once that he did it because he wanted the man to remember who had given it to him. He said it was a kind of insurance. He said, 'Maggie, if a man is carrying my name on his rifle, he is going to bring himself home, because he is going to bring me home.'" She looked up at Murchison over the rims of her reading glasses. She said, "I always thought it was a strange thing to say." Murchison felt the sweet tea go cold in his hand. He thought about a strip of green duct tape on the pistol grip of a CAR-15, lying in red laterite mud on a ridge in southern Laos. He said, "Ma'am, one more question." He said, "Did your husband ever talk about a place called the Quiet Room?" Margaret Weems went very still in her wicker chair. She said, "Mr. Murchison, I am going to ask you to leave now." She said it gently, without anger. She said it the way a person says it when they have been afraid of a question for 44 years and have finally heard it asked out loud. Murchison drove back to Memphis that evening with the photograph in his portfolio and the phrase "Quiet Room" repeating in his head like a song he could not place. He had heard the phrase exactly twice in his career. The first time had been in 1973 in a bar in Bangkok from a master sergeant who had been 3 drinks past discretion. The master sergeant had said, "You do not want to know about the quiet room, sir. The quiet room is where they put the men who do the things the rest of us do not get told about. Murchison had been a captain then, and he had taken the advice, and he had not asked again. The second time had been in a margin note on a declassified document from the early 1980s, a single line in a footnote that read, "See also activity QR/macv-sog, records destroyed." The phrase had not surfaced in his life again until a small, white-haired woman in Tupelo, Mississippi had asked him to leave her porch. He spent 6 weeks chasing it. The personnel file of Major Curtis Weems contained, between the autumn of 1968 and the early winter of 1970, a 14-month gap. The gap was labeled, in the standardized phrasing of the era, TDY/CONUS/classified activities. There was no further detail. The file picked up again with Weems's reassignment to the fictional tactical squadron at Ubon Royal Thai Air Base in the late winter of 1970. From that point until his loss in the early dry season of 1971, the file was unremarkable. He flew Phantoms. He flew them well. He had been recommended for 2 air medals. The personnel file of Captain Glenn Hargrove contained a similar gap. So did the files of 3 other Phantom pilots who had served at Ubon in the same time frame and were now retired or deceased. The pattern was consistent enough that Murchison stopped considering it a coincidence by the 3rd file. In the late summer, he flew to San Antonio to meet a retired sergeant major named Roy Thibodeau, who had been Glenn Hargrove's crew chief at Ubon and had agreed to talk over coffee at a diner near Lackland. Thibodeau was a small, wiry man in his late 70s, with a Cajun accent that had thinned but not vanished, and hands that still moved as if they were tightening a fitting on a J79 engine. He drank his coffee black and ate 3 pieces of toast and asked after Murchison's career for a polite 10 minutes before he said, "All right, sir, what do you want to know?" Murchison said, "The quiet room." Thibodeau did not flinch. He had been expecting the question. He had probably been expecting it for 44 years. He said, "I never went there. I want to be clear on that. I was a wrench. I worked the line. But I knew which of my pilots had been there because they came back different. They were still good pilots. They were just quieter. They drank less. They smiled less." Hargrove had been there. Weems had been there. 3 other men I will not name had been there. They did not talk about it among themselves on the flight line, but I could see them not talking about it, and that was its own kind of conversation. Murchison asked what the quiet room actually was. Thibodeau took a long swallow of coffee. He said it was a unit. It did not have a number. It was attached to macv-sog on paper, but only on the paper that was never going to be looked at. They ran what we called housekeeping. You can guess what housekeeping means in that context. They went in small, in-country and out-of-country, and they cleaned up problems. Some of those problems were people. Some of those problems were equipment. Some of those problems were our own. Murchison said, "Our own." Thibodeau looked at him for a long time over the coffee cup. He said, "Sir, I am not going to spell that out for you. You have been in this long enough to spell it out for yourself." Murchison drove back to the airport with the phrase, "our own," riding in the passenger seat. That night, in his hotel room near the runway, he opened his laptop and pulled up the report Dr. Carver had sent him on the duct-taped CAR-15. He read the section on the serial number lot for the 3rd time. The lot had been signed out of a depot in Okinawa in the autumn of 1969. The signing officer was Major Curtis Weems. The end user was listed only as TDY/CONUS/special activities. The lot consisted of 42 carbines. Murchison stared at that number. 42. He pulled up the Carver report on the 4 ground rifles. Their serial numbers traced to a different lot, signed out by a different officer, but consigned to the same end-user designation. That lot had also consisted of 42 carbines. Both lots had subsequently been listed for destruction. Both destruction orders had been signed off by the same field-grade officer, whose name appeared on the form as Lieutenant Colonel R. Hargrove, J4. Murchison stopped breathing for a second. Hargrove, the same surname as the Phantom's backseater. He pulled up Glenn Hargrove's personnel file and scrolled to the next of kin section. Father, deceased 1966. Mother, deceased 1978. One sibling, older brother. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hargrove, United States Army, retired in 1973. Address unknown. Glenn Hargrove's older brother had signed the destruction order on the rifles that ended up on the ridge. The rifles had not been destroyed. They had been issued instead to 4 men whose unit did not officially exist, who walked onto a ridge in Laos in the early dry season of 1971, and who were killed there by bombs dropped by Glenn Hargrove's own aircraft. Murchison closed the laptop and sat in the dark of the hotel room and listened to the ice machine cycle on at the end of the hall. He picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Carver. He said, "I need you to find me a forward air controller, somebody who was working that grid square in the early dry season of 1971. Somebody who was still alive." She said, "I will start tomorrow." He said, "Elaine, start tonight." The forward air controller from that morning was alive. His name was Roy Thibodeau. He lived in a stilt house on a canal in Pensacola, Florida, with a screened porch and a small aluminum boat tied to a piling out back. He was 81 years old. He had a tremor in his left hand that he hid by keeping it in his pocket when he met new people. He was not the same Roy Thibodeau as Glenn Hargrove's crew chief. He was, in fact, the crew chief's older brother by 11 minutes. Twins. Murchison flew into Pensacola in the early summer of 2015 and rented a car at the airport and drove out to the canal in a heavy rain. The wipers on the rental could not keep up. He sat in the driveway for a full minute after he pulled up to the house, watching the water sheet off the windshield, and then he ran for the porch with his portfolio over his head. The man on the porch was sitting in a wicker chair with a glass of iced tea on the side table. He stood up to shake Murchison's hand. The left hand stayed in his pocket. He said, "Sergeant Murchison, my brother told me you were coming." Murchison said, "Lieutenant Colonel, actually, and I had hoped to surprise you." Thibodeau smiled. He said, "Sir, I have been waiting to be surprised about this for 44 years. You are welcome to it." They sat on the porch, and the rain came down in sheets on the canal. Thibodeau did not offer the iced tea. He drank from his own glass. He said, "What do you want to know?" Murchison said, "I want to know what happened on the morning of the strike." Thibodeau looked out at the canal for a long time. The rain lifted briefly and then closed in again, a curtain of gray water that turned the far bank into a smear of green. He said, "I was a captain then. I was flying an O-2 Skymaster out of a forward strip in country working the Bolaven sector. The mission that morning was Operation Jade Lantern, close air support for a friendly element on the ground. I came up on station at first light. I made contact with the friendly element on a frequency I had been given in the briefing the night before. I confirmed their position by smoke. I called in 2 Phantoms. I gave them a target grid. They rolled in. They dropped. They hit." He stopped. Murchison waited. Thibodeau said, "Sir, the grid I gave the Phantoms was not the grid in my briefing folder." Murchison set down his glass. He said, "Explain that." Thibodeau took his left hand out of his pocket and laid it flat on the wicker arm of the chair. The tremor was bad enough that the wicker creaked. He said, "The night before the strike, I was given a target packet at the operations tent at Ubon. The packet had the friendly element's call sign, the friendly element's expected location, the target grid, and a contingency grid in case the target moved. The packet was signed by an operations officer whose name I did not recognize. I took the packet to my hooch. I read it twice. I went to sleep. In the morning, before the brief, I went to the operations tent to refresh my coffee, and I left the packet on the table for 90 seconds. He said, when I came back, the packet was where I had left it. The cover sheet was the same. The grids inside were not. Murchison felt a cold weight settle behind his sternum. He said, "You are telling me somebody swapped the target packet." Thibodeau said, "I am telling you somebody swapped the grids inside it. The cover sheet was the same. The signature was the same. The numbers were not." I did not notice for 2 reasons. The handwriting was identical, which meant whoever did it had practiced. And I did not double-check because I had read the packet the night before and I trusted my own memory. He said, by the time I called in the strike, I was reading off numbers that were not the numbers I had been given. Murchison said, the friendly element on the ground. Thibodeau said, I confirmed them by smoke. They popped purple smoke. I confirmed purple. The phantoms rolled in. The bombs fell. The friendly element went off the air. He was quiet for a long time. He said, I called for a damage assessment. I was told there was no friendly element in that grid. I was told the friendly element had been somewhere else. I was told to log the strike as a successful interdiction on a suspected enemy supply route. I was told this by the same operations officer whose name I did not recognize on the packet. He was sitting in the operations tent when I landed. He looked at me when he said it. He did not blink. Murchison said, the name on the packet. Thibodeau walked into the house and came back 2 minutes later with a manila envelope. He set it on the side table. He said, I kept a photocopy. I was not supposed to. I did. I have not opened it in 31 years. He slid it across. Murchison opened it. The photocopy was faded but legible. The cover sheet of the target packet for the morning strike on the Bolaven Plateau, early dry season, 1971. The signature at the bottom was a long, looping cursive. The printed name beneath it was a name that was not in any duty roster Murchison had pulled for that day. The name was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hargrove, Glenn Hargrove's older brother. Thibodeau said, Sir, I do not know what you have stumbled into, but I have been waiting 44 years for somebody to ask me about that morning, and I would like you to find out what happened to my friendly element. Murchison said, Your friendly element. Thibodeau said, Sir, the call sign on the packet was Quiet Room 3. I did not know what that meant at the time. I do not know what it means now. But those were my people. Murchison sat on the porch and watched the rain fall on the canal and felt the entire shape of the case rotate 1 full turn beneath him, like a ship coming about in a heavy sea. The cockpit voice recorder fragment was a piece of magnetic tape the size of a credit card. It had been recovered from the wreckage in 1975 by a Pathet Lao patrol, sold to a Thai antiquities dealer in 1981, recovered by an American intelligence officer in 1993, and shipped to a laboratory in Maryland, where it had sat in a climate-controlled vault for 22 years, while 3 generations of audio engineers attempted to coax intelligible sound out of it. The tape had been damaged by heat, by water, by mold, and by a brief but disastrous attempt at restoration in 1997 that had nearly destroyed it entirely. In the autumn of 2015, the chief technician at the Maryland laboratory called Dr. Carver and told her he had something for her. She flew to Maryland the next morning. Murchison met her there. The laboratory was in a brick building on a quiet street in a town that did not appear on most maps. The chief technician was a man in his 60s named Ernie Posner, who had been working on classified audio recoveries since the late 1970s. He had the careful, slow manner of a man who had spent his career listening to the last words of dead people. He said, I have got you 41 seconds. The first 30 are mostly engine noise and routine call-outs. The last 11 are different. I have cleaned them up as much as I am going to be able to. I am going to play them for you once, And then I am going to leave the room, because you are going to want to react, and I do not want to watch." He pressed a key on the console. For the first 30 seconds, the room filled with the buzz of a J-79 engine at high power and the routine cross-cockpit chatter of a Phantom II on a low-altitude run-in. Glenn Hargrove called off airspeed and altitude. Curtis Weems acknowledged. The forward air controller, in a voice that was unmistakably the younger Roy Thibodeau's, called for them to come left 2 degrees and confirm the smoke. Weems said, "Tally on the smoke." He said, "Tally on the target." Then there was a pause. The pause was perhaps a half-second long. In that half-second, the engine noise did not change, and the airspeed did not change, but something in Curtis Weems' breathing changed, audibly, in a way that the chief technician had spent 8 months isolating from the noise floor. Weems said, "Wait." He said, "Wait." He said, "Those are friendlies. Those are." There was a fractional pause. Murchison would later count it on a stopwatch and find it was exactly 7/10 of a second. Weems said, "Roy, that is Roy down there. Roy, abort, abort, abort!" The transmit key clicked off. The next sound was the deep, concussive thump of the bombs leaving the racks, which on a Phantom II happened on a delay timer that could not be cancelled inside 3 seconds of release. Then the sound of the engine pitch changing as the aircraft began its pullout. Then a high metallic tearing noise. Then static. Then nothing. 41 seconds. Carver did not move. Murchison sat in the chair beside her with his hands flat on his thighs and stared at the console and felt the floor of the room give way beneath him in slow motion. Roy. Major Curtis Weems, in the last 7/10 of a second of his ability to speak, had not used a call sign. He had not used a rank. He had used a first name. He had used the first name of the forward air controller who had called him in. But the forward air controller was alive, on a porch in Pensacola, drinking iced tea and shaking with a tremor in his left hand. The forward air controller was Roy Thibodeau. There were 2 Roy Thibodeaus, the crew chief and— Murchison stood up so suddenly that the chair scraped on the linoleum. He said, "Elaine, the photograph." She knew which photograph he meant. She had a copy in her own portfolio, the print Margaret Weems had given him from a corrugated steel hanger somewhere with no markings. 4 men in tiger-stripe fatigues, Weems on the left, Hargrove second from the left, 2 strangers on the right with the same long face. Brothers. Carver pulled the photograph out of the portfolio and held it up. Murchison pointed at the man third from the left, the taller of the 2 long-faced strangers. He said, "That is not the forward air controller." Carver said, "I know." He said, "That is the forward air controller's brother," Carver said, "his twin brother." The twin brother, Henry Thibodeau. Murchison sat back down in the chair. The blood was running out of his face. Ernie Posner came back into the room with 3 paper cups of coffee and stopped in the doorway when he saw their expressions. And then he set the cups down very carefully on the console and walked back out without saying anything. Murchison said, Curtis Weems looked through the canopy at the men on the ground, and he saw a face he knew. He used a first name because the face he saw and the voice on the radio had the same name. Carver said, "He tried to abort. The bombs were already off the racks." Murchison said, "The man on the ground who was the forward air controller's twin brother was not just any operator. That photograph was taken at a quiet room training facility in the summer of 1969. Those 4 men trained together. Weems and Hargrove flew them in. The Thibodeau brothers led teams on the ground. They were a unit." Carver said, "And somebody put 2 of them on opposite ends of the same bomb run." Murchison said, with a target packet swapped by Glenn Hargrove's own brother. He looked down at the photograph. The 4 smiling men in tiger-stripe fatigues looked back at him out of the summer of 1969, when they had still been alive and had still been on the same side. Murchison flew back to Pensacola in the first cold week of December. He did not call ahead. He drove from the airport in the late afternoon in a slate-gray rental, and he parked under the same live oak in the same gravel driveway and sat for a moment watching the wind move on the canal. The rain had passed. The air was clear and cold in a way that Florida air rarely was, and the screened porch was empty. Roy Thibodeau opened the front door before Murchison could knock. He had been watching from the window. He stepped aside without speaking and led Murchison into the front room, which was furnished with an old leather couch and a coffee table and a small television tuned to a college football game with the sound off. On the wall above the couch was a framed black-and-white photograph of two boys, perhaps 9 years old, identical in the face, standing on a porch in southern Louisiana with their arms around each other's shoulders. Murchison sat down on the leather couch. Thibodeau sat in an armchair facing him. He did not turn the television off. The blue light moved on his face. Murchison said, "I have heard the cockpit voice recorder." Thibodeau nodded once. He did not ask what was on it. He had been waiting for a long time, and waiting men do not ask. Murchison said, "Your brother was on the ridge. Your twin brother, Henry. He was the team leader of the quiet room patrol that the bombs hit." Thibodeau closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long time. When he opened them, he said, "I knew. I have known since that afternoon." Murchison said, "You knew?" Thibodeau said, "Sir, I confirmed purple smoke. The friendly element popped purple smoke. Henry and I had agreed before I shipped out for that tour that purple was the family color. Purple was what we used between us. Henry had not told me he was on that ridge. He could not have. The quiet room did not let its men tell their families anything. But when I saw the purple smoke, I knew it was him. I knew Henry was somewhere underneath me." Murchison said, "And you called the phantoms in anyway?" Thibodeau did not flinch. He said, "I called the phantoms in on the grid I had been given. The grid was not the grid in my briefing folder. I read the numbers off the packet. I did not match the numbers to the smoke. I should have. I did not. The packet had been swapped. I have told you that." He said, "I have spent 44 years asking myself whether I knew, in some part of myself, that the numbers were wrong, and I called them anyway. I have not been able to answer that question. I am not going to lie to you and tell you I have." Murchison sat very still on the leather couch. He said, "Curtis Weems used your first name, in the cockpit, in the last 7/10 of a second before the bombs released. He looked through the canopy and he saw Henry on the ground, and he said your name." Thibodeau's left hand began to shake on the arm of the chair. He did not put it in his pocket this time. He let it shake. He said, "I know." Murchison said, "You know." Thibodeau said, "Curtis Weems and my brother had been close, closer than my brother and I had been in those last 2 years. The quiet room did that to men. It made them family in a way the actual family could not compete with. Curtis used to call my brother Roy on the radio sometimes when there were not supposed to be names on the radio. He did it because we sounded the same. He thought it was funny. Henry thought it was funny. I did not always think it was funny." He looked up at Murchison. He said, "I have wondered every day whether my brother was killed because of a mistake on a piece of paper or because somebody in the operations tent at Ubon needed Henry Thibodeau dead and decided to use a phantom to do it. I do not know the answer. I have a theory. I have not been brave enough to chase it." Murchison said, "What is the theory?" Thibodeau looked at the football game on the muted television. He said, "The quiet room was not just a unit that did housekeeping. The quiet room kept a ledger. Henry kept a copy. Henry told me, on a leave in 1969, that he had a copy of every operation the quiet room had run, and the names of every operator and every target, and that he had hidden it somewhere in the world that nobody would ever find. He told me that if anything happened to him, the ledger would surface. He told me he had a dead man's switch. I do not know what the switch was, I do not know if it ever tripped. I have wondered my whole life whether the people who ran the quiet room found out about the ledger, and whether they decided to swap a target packet at Uban to make my brother go away. He said, I have wondered whether Curtis Weems was meant to be the trigger, whether they routed him onto Henry deliberately because the irony of it was useful, or whether Curtis was a casualty too, whether the men in the operations tent did not care which quiet room operators they erased that morning, as long as Henry was one of them. He looked at Murchison. He said, Sir, I am an old man with a tremor in his hand. I do not have proof. I have a theory and a brother in a coffin and a piece of duct tape with a name on it. Murchison said, The duct tape. Thibodeau said, Curtis gave that rifle to Henry in the summer of '69. He told Henry, I am putting my name on this so you will bring it home, and so you will bring yourself home with it. Henry showed it to me on his last leave. He laughed about it. He said, I have got Curtis's name on my rifle. He said, that man is going to make sure I come home. Thibodeau's left hand was still shaking. He said, I think Curtis tried to. The retired colonel lived in a stuccoed house on a dead-end street in a retirement community north of Tucson. The community was called Saguaro Vista. It was the kind of place that had a guard at the gate during the day and a security camera at night, and a homeowners association that was more vigilant than the guard. Murchison had located the colonel through 3 months of cross-referencing pension records, property transfers, and a single lapsed driver's license that had been issued under a previous surname. The colonel had retired from the United States Army in the late winter of 1973, 6 months before he was eligible for full benefits, and had moved twice in the next 2 years and changed his surname once during a brief and undocumented marriage. The marriage had been annulled. The surname had not. His name on the swapped target packet had been Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hargrove. His name on his Arizona driver's license was Robert Vance. He was Glenn Hargrove's older brother. Murchison drove out to Saguaro Vista on a clear, cold morning in early March. He parked his rental at the curb and walked up the flagstone path and rang the bell. The chime inside the house was a faint 2-note electronic version of the first bar of the Army song. He waited. The door opened on a chain. Behind it stood a tall, thin man in his early 80s, in a cream-colored cardigan with white hair and a long face. The face was the same face Murchison had seen on Glenn Hargrove's bones in the laboratory in Honolulu, aged 44 years. Murchison said, Colonel, my name is Dale Murchison. I am with the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency. I would like to ask you about your brother. Robert Hargrove looked at him through the chain for a long moment. He said, You have come about the ridge in Laos. Murchison said, Yes, sir. Hargrove closed his eyes. He said, My lawyer told me you would come eventually. He told me to say nothing. I have not paid my lawyer in a year. I am 82 years old. I have a tumor in my left lung that is not going to be operated on. I do not have a great deal of interest in saying nothing. He did not, however, open the chain. He said, I cannot let you in. Not because I do not want to, because there are people who watch this house. They are not very good at it anymore, but they are there. I will pass you a piece of paper. After that, you will leave, and you will not come back, because if you come back, I will be moved, and the paper will be the only thing you ever got. Murchison said, All right. Hargrove disappeared from the door. He came back 40 seconds later. Through the gap in the chain, he passed Murchison a single sheet of yellowed paper, folded twice. Murchison took it without unfolding it. Hargrove said, That is a duty assignment from the late autumn of 1970. It lists 7 men. 3 of them are in the cockpit of an aircraft on a ridge in Laos. 4 of them were on the ground beneath that aircraft. The 8th name on the list is the commanding officer. Murchison said, 8th name? Hargrove said, I miscounted, forgive me. 7 operators and 1 commanding officer. The commanding officer's name on that list has been redacted with a black marker. I did the redaction myself in my own kitchen in the autumn of 1973 with a felt-tip pen I bought at a stationery store in Frankfurt. I redacted it because I was afraid. I am still afraid. I have been afraid for 43 years. The redaction is the last useful thing I am going to do in this life. Murchison said, "Sir, who was the commanding officer?" Hargrove looked at him through the chain. He said, "I am not going to tell you, not because I do not want you to know, because if I tell you and they find out I told you, they will move me before sundown and the paper will be useless." The paper is useful only because the redaction is intact. The redaction is the proof that the name was there and that I was afraid to keep it. If you find the name on your own, the paper corroborates you. If I tell you, the paper corroborates nothing. He said, "I am sorry, Mr. Murchison." He said, "I am sorry about my brother." He closed the door. Murchison heard the chain rattle and the deadbolt turn, and then the soft electronic two-note army song chime as the door's contact sensor closed the alarm circuit. He stood on the flagstone path for a long moment, holding the folded sheet of paper. The wind moved in the saguaros at the edge of the lot. A roadrunner crossed the gravel. He walked back to the rental and got in and drove out of Saguaro Vista without looking in the rear-view mirror. That night, in a hotel near the airport, he unfolded the paper on the bedspread under the lamp. It was a duty assignment dated late autumn 1970. Header redacted. Unit designation redacted. The body of the document listed 7 names in alphabetical order. Hargrove, Glenn R., Captain, USAF. Hargrove, Robert L., Lieutenant Colonel, USA. Thibodeau, Henry P., Master Sergeant, USA. Thibodeau, Roy P., Captain, USAF. 2 more names Murchison did not yet know. And at the bottom, Weems, Curtis L., Major, USAF. Below the list, in the space marked Commanding Officer/Authority, there was a thick black rectangle of felt-tip ink applied carefully in 2 coats, with no edges of legibility remaining. Murchison sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the redaction for a long time. He thought about the colonel's last words. The paper is useful only because the redaction is intact. He folded the paper and put it back in his portfolio and turned out the lamp. He did not sleep. The funeral for Major Curtis Weems was held on a green afternoon in late June, at a small cemetery on the south side of Tupelo, under a sky that could not decide between rain and sun. The remains of Captain Glenn Hargrove had been buried 2 weeks earlier in Pennsylvania, at his parents' plot, in a service his older brother Robert had not attended. The 4 ground operators had been buried in 4 different states, in 4 separate ceremonies, after their identities had been confirmed through dental records and medical histories. The Department of Defense had, after a long and quiet negotiation, acknowledged that the 4 men had been operating in a classified capacity in the early dry season of 1971 and had been killed in the course of their duties. The acknowledgement did not name the unit. It did not name the operation. It used the phrase "circumstances which remain under review." Murchison flew into Memphis the day before and drove down the trace in the same rental Ford he had used the year before. The pecan trees were in full leaf. The road was empty. He stopped once at a gas station outside Holly Springs and bought a bottle of water and a pack of cigarettes he did not intend to smoke. The graveside service was small. Margaret Weems stood under a black umbrella next to her daughter from Memphis. The honor guard fired 3 volleys. A bugler played taps from a slight rise above the headstones. The flag was folded and presented. Margaret Weems took it without crying, the way she had clearly rehearsed for 44 years. Afterward, at the small reception in the parish hall of a Methodist church a mile from the cemetery, Murchison waited until the line of well-wishers had thinned, and then walked over to her. He said, "Ma'am?" She said, "Mr. Murchison." He said, "Ma'am, I have something to give you. It is not government property anymore. Dr. Carver and I went through some channels. It is yours if you want it." He took out the small, flat plastic evidence sleeve. Inside it was the strip of green duct tape from the pistol grip of the CAR-15 found on the ridge in Laos. The tape had been preserved in the lab in Honolulu. The blue ballpoint handwriting was still legible. Weems, Tupelo. Margaret Weems took the sleeve with both hands. She held it under the parish hall light. She traced the letters through the plastic with one finger. She said, "That is his hand." Murchison said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "And the rifle was on the ground." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a long time. Around them, the parish hall was emptying. The honor guard had folded the chairs along the back wall. A woman in a blue dress was carrying a coffee urn into the kitchen. Margaret Weems said, "I told you on my porch last spring that he had a habit. He wrote his name on the equipment of men he trusted. He told me it was a kind of insurance." She said, "He did it for one more reason. I did not tell you the rest of it because I was not sure I would ever speak about it again. I will tell you now." She said, "He wrote his name on the gear of men he expected to come home. Not men he hoped would come home. Men he had decided in his own mind were going to come home, no matter what. He told me once that if he ever wrote his name on a man's gear and that man did not come back, then he would not come back either. He said it the way some men make a promise to God. He was not a religious man, Mr. Murchison. He had his own promises." She looked up at him. She said, "The man who had this rifle." Murchison said, "Ma'am, his name was Henry Thibodeau. He was a master sergeant. He led a small unit. He died on the same ridge as your husband, in the same 10 seconds." Margaret Weems closed her eyes. The plastic sleeve trembled slightly in her hand. She said, "Then Curtis kept his promise." Murchison said, "Ma'am." She said, "He wrote his name on that man's rifle because he had decided that man was going to come home. And when it turned out that man was not going to come home, Curtis did not come home either. He did not let the man go alone. I do not believe he chose it. I believe his hand chose it. I believe his eyes saw Henry on the ground and his hand could not pull the aircraft up in time because his hand had made a promise 4 years before, and the promise was still on the rifle." She handed the evidence sleeve back to Murchison. She said, "You keep it. I do not need it. I have known the answer for 44 years. I just did not have the proof." She turned and walked across the parish hall to her daughter, who was waiting by the door with her keys in her hand. Margaret Weems did not look back. Murchison stood in the empty parish hall for a long time, holding the strip of duct tape under the fluorescent light. Dr. Carver had finished her final report a week before the funeral. The 4 ground operators had been identified. The 2 cockpit crew had been identified. The forward air controller's testimony had been entered into the agency record under seal. The retired colonel in Arizona had died of his lung tumor in the spring, and the redacted duty assignment, with its black rectangle in the space where the commanding officer's name had been transferred to the National Archives, where it would remain in a sealed file until the year 2075. The name behind the redaction had not been recovered. Dr. Carver had run the felt-tip ink under 3 different imaging spectra. She had tried infrared, ultraviolet, and a hyperspectral process developed at a laboratory in New Mexico. None of them had pulled the name through. The colonel had used the right pen. He had applied the ink in the right number of coats. He had been careful, in his Frankfurt kitchen in 1973, in a way that had survived 4 decades. Whoever had run the quiet room remained, and remains, a black rectangle on a yellowed page. Murchison drove back to Memphis that evening with the windows down. The pecan trees moved overhead in the wind. The radio in the rental was tuned to a country station out of Tupelo, and a song he did not recognize was playing low. He thought about a small woman on a porch in a blue cotton dress, who had told him that her husband's hand had made a promise. He thought about a man on a screened porch in Pensacola, with a tremor in his left hand, who had wondered for 44 years whether the numbers had been wrong, and he had read them anyway. He thought about a strip of green duct tape in a plastic sleeve on the passenger seat beside him. He did not think about the black rectangle. He had decided, somewhere between the parish hall and the highway, that he was not going to think about it again. He had also decided that this was a lie he was going to tell himself for the rest of his life, and that he was going to be mostly successful at it, and that on certain nights, in a cabin in Idaho he had not yet bought, he was going to lie awake and think about it anyway. The road was empty. The wind was warm. The cemetery was behind him. He drove north, toward home, and the duct tape rode on the seat beside him, and the name on it, in faded blue ballpoint, was still legible. You stayed until the end, which means this man is no longer nameless. Support the channel. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. Share this video. Let it reach someone who remembers. There are many more classified stories still waiting.